Welcome to Paul's Passive House. So here we get a good look at the construction of my wall. There's mineral wool bats between the studs, and there's polyiso on top of that, sealed at the top to the polyiso that's in the attic. It's also sealed at the bottom to the floor. Now, here I've installed some more polyiso. This is a different product because I needed a different thickness. That's 2-inch pink foam. I think that's XPS foam. But that foam, that pink foam, is 2 inches because I needed enough space between this wall and my cabinets to get a refrigerator in and out easily. But the same process applies. I sealed the bottom, and I'm going to seal all these seams that I'm showing you, but you get a good look at a finished product. A couple of details to note are the thermal break that I installed at this point. Here you see that pink ribbed foam. That's just like 1/8 of an inch of foam that I stapled to the window frame. That allows for a thermal break. Now, it's not going to give me great insulative thermal barrier, but it is a break. And the most important aspect is to incorporate a break. As you look at the pink foam where it meets the other frame of the window, you notice that it looks silver. That's a 1/2-inch piece of foam. It's polyiso, and I installed it all the way around the window. That polyiso gives me a thermal break, which again is very important. It also gives me a nice surface to tape or seal or caulk to the window and to the other piece of foam. At every point where this foam connects or butts up against each other, I'm going to seal it. I had a quick bit of modification I had to do and fill in this one bay with polyiso, and then it was on to measuring this wall. What I'm doing here is measuring all of these spaces, all of the wood, all of the studs, all of the backing, all of the headers, so that I can get an accurate map of this wall. And I'm drawing that map into a notebook. Then later on, after I've installed the 3.5 inches of polyiso, I'll know where all the studs are. I'll know how thick the headers are. I'll know where the double studs are, and so on. And it will help me when I'm installing the interior studs, the studs that are going to go on the other side of the polyiso. It'll also help me with drywall. It'll help me with putting in new windows and so on. I'll have that reference, those maps to refer to later on when other things have to change in this house. At this point, I'm measuring out the individual studs and marking them in my map. Any differences between the studs at the top of the window and the studs at the bottom of the window are going to be reflected on my map. And my map's measurements are going to be on center. So any measurement that I take and transpose into my map is going to be to the center of the stud from the wall. I've also notated when I'm measuring from polyiso and when I'm measuring from the studs. So if I'm measuring out 67 inches from the left side here, I put a note in the map that the thing I measured off of was 3.5 inches of polyiso. Now it's time to make my cuts and install the polyiso over the studs. If you look in the background there, I've got pallets and pallets full of 3.5-inch 4x8 sheets of polyiso. And I used that to insulate the attic, insulate all my walls, and as it turns out, I had some left over. I'm using an 8-foot level as a straight edge so that I get good, clean cuts in this polyiso. One thing about cutting thick polyiso is if you only score one side and then try to break it, it will break unevenly and uncleanly. I'm using a 5-inch knife to cut through this polyiso, and I score it multiple times to make sure that I get through all the polyiso cleanly and as straight as possible. The more I worked with this polyiso, the more clear it became that it was going to be difficult to work with. And this actually was quite difficult, especially when you compare it to that pink product that I showed you earlier. Now, I'm trimming a little bit of this piece because I need some space at the top and bottom for spray foam to seal the top and bottom and make that continuous thermal barrier. So now it's time to install the piece, and luckily I made my map, so I know exactly where to measure and mark this piece so that when I screw in those circular plastic washers that hold it in place, I know that that screw is going to go directly into the center of a stud right behind this piece. It's time to cut the second piece on the other side of the window. Now, I chose to cut that piece first, and then I would measure and cut for the pieces that go between it. You'll notice that I'm doing an awful lot of dry fitting. I don't know what it is about me, but I like to dry fit things. I'm never convinced that my work is done. So I dry fit, I wait, I see if it bows out, I see if there are any cracks developing or I hear any movement. And then after a couple of days, I actually secure the wall down and tape it or seal it and consider it my final installation. Now it's time to cut that first cross piece, and I believe this is the piece that goes below the window. If you don't already have one of these really handy 5-inch knives, I recommend you get one, even if you're not going to be cutting thick polyiso. They're incredibly handy, they're incredibly easy to work with, and it's a much nicer product than a typical utility knife. You'll notice here that this was a little too snug. That was the problem I kept running into. When I would score this polyiso and cut it with the blade and then break it, it would break unevenly. And so I learned very quickly early on that make sure I cut the polyiso straight. Don't score it and then break it because you'll have to trim it later. And trimming is a nightmare. Installing this final piece above the window, and the window will be fully encapsulated. There's something very satisfying about this work, and you get a nice close look at exactly what the finished product looks like. If you'd like a free energy efficiency consultation, please email me at paulspassivehouse@gmail.com.